Mr. American Girl is intended for adult audiences and may contain coarse language, adult themes, and chronically online brain rot. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi, it's me, Jonathan. So I am still workshopping the title and thumbnail for today's video, so if I said something truly insane, I am genuinely sorry. But this was a really hard episode for me to make today, and it got really personal. But what we're talking about today has bugged me for pretty much my entire life, and that's to do with how gendered everything in this world is, and what kind of problems that creates, not just for people that don't quite fit into society's standards for gender, but also the people that eagerly subscribe to it. It's something that's come up time and time again with the American Girl doll brand, especially when it comes to people like me that have really strong opinions about it and the brand's 40-year history. A lot of people think that boys and men do not belong in a space that's centered around a doll line and stories that were originally centered around young girls to teach about girlhood. After all, the company was founded with the intent of teaching young girls what it was like to be a girl through different periods in history. But our understanding of gender is continuing to evolve, and while modern society still has a really long way to go, it seems like the American Girl brand is having to toe the line between its original mission and keeping up with the ever-evolving landscape of girlhood. This entire time, the company has been using very specific language with regards to gender, and at times it can feel really archaic, but on the other hand, it can kind of feel like they're trying to maintain space for girls in a culture where it feels like opportunities and rights for girls and women are continuing to shrink by the day. And where does that leave me? And was this ever any of my business in the first place? And why am I still here? Well, I guess today you're gonna find out. Welcome to a brand new episode of Mr. American Girl. I recently took a trip out to my parents' house in rural North Carolina, and I dug out an old photo album one night before bed, and as I was flipping through it, I was actually kind of surprised at how emotional it was for me to look at pictures of myself as a child. I think it is for many of us, and I mean, on one hand, I can see how I had a really good childhood on paper. I mean, I had two parents that loved me, I never went hungry, and I went to a pretty good school. But under the surface, I knew something wasn't quite normal. I knew that I was different, and it wasn't because of some internal feeling that I had that just bubbled up out of nowhere. I knew I was different because people told me I was different. And it wasn't just my peers. I mean, adults did it too. I can remember even as early as 1988 begging for the new Superstar Barbie for Christmas. And I just remember my parents looking at me kind of puzzled almost, and they laughed for a second, and then just sort of like I was met with a firm no, those are for girls. I was also teased pretty badly as a kid as well, and I just remember boys would make fun of me, and they would do it both to my face and behind my back, but they wouldn't just say like, oh, that I acted like a girl. They would say that I was a girl. And while obviously being a girl isn't bad or worse than being a boy, I was a really little kid trying to figure out how I fit into this world. And sure, I was kind of effeminate. I talked effeminately. I was into things that were marketed towards girls, and I had kind of long hair. I mean, it was a bowl cut. That was what was in style in the 80s. And I didn't know why I was the way I was. I just was. Well, except for the bowl cut. That was my mom's fault. When you're a child, there are so many things that you hold as true, even though they're not necessarily objective truths of the universe. Things like dolls are for girls and boys shouldn't cry. Your life is so structured when you're young, and so much of that is adults trying to teach you about the world around you. You're constantly obeying authority, and you never really question the things that they tell you, especially when you're really young. And when I was little, I didn't have the maturity to understand that most adults are just projecting the things that they've amalgamated throughout their entire life, and adults can just be wrong about stuff. I mean, they're wrong about stuff all the time, but when you're a kid, you don't know that. And most adults make it through life without really questioning a lot of the things that they were told when they were younger, that they grew up and carried with them. And I think that's mainly because for most people, that's just comfortable for them. But likely, I think deep down in every single person, there's always at least that one thing that makes you feel different from everybody else around you. you. It could be something seemingly innocuous, like, being a woman that really wishes she could buzz all her hair off and not hear some lame comments from men about it, or something more life-altering, like considering leaving your church. But for whatever reason, adults have had a long-standing history of projecting their insecurities and fears about the world onto children. And when you're 5 years old, you don't understand the complexity of all that. You just see the same person that told you the stove was hot is also telling you that dolls are for girls, and so very bad things would happen if you either touched the stove or you got a doll. When you're that young, you don't know the difference. That was reinforced by the fact that whenever an adult would ask me what I wanted for Christmas every year, and I said, I want an American Girl doll, they would at best laugh at me, but I would also catch the sideways looks that they would give me, and sometimes even catch them whispering to each other about me. And I want to be clear, this wasn't just like one time that I'm blowing out of proportion. This was a regular experience for me as a child, whether it was teachers, family members, coaches, or whatever. I don't even know how to describe that feeling. I think shame is probably the closest thing I can, point to as to what that feeling was like. But I was a feminine boy, and at a very early age, I knew that indescribable feeling of what it was like to have an adult look at you like you were dirty. And that was just me being who I naturally was and liking the things that I naturally liked. Look, I know I'm trauma dumping a little bit today, and I wouldn't do this if I didn't feel like it was relevant to today's episode, but it kind of gives you the backdrop for how I ended up where I am now, and all of the steps it took to get here, good or bad. And I guess, to be fair, I technically had like a couple of dolls and was able to like sneak playing with them at a friend's house here and there, but I did end up getting one of the Cabbage Patch Kids Splash and Tan dolls that was really fun. And the other thing I got was the Rollerblade Dude doll by Mattel from 1992. But I very clearly remember that I was only allowed to have dolls that were boy characters and seemingly marketed towards boys, because that sort of gave my parents permission to buy them for me. But yeah, I was only allowed to have dolls that were specifically marketed towards me, and there were literally like 2. One of which I reunited with recently, actually. This is the Rollerblade Dude doll by Mattel from 1992, which, like I said, was one of the 2 dolls that I can remember being able to get my hands on. He's like, basically he's got this mechanism in him that I think you put batteries in him or wind him up, and he like will skate a lot. He'll actually like roller skate on his own, and rollerblading was really big at the time, and I actually had a pair of rollerblades, I guess skating circles in our garage, thinking I was like Nancy Kerrigan, but I mean, realistically, I guess I'm more of a Tanya Harding. But I absolutely love this doll. This was not my original childhood one. I actually had to buy this off of eBay because basically most of my childhood toys got thrown out when when I grew up. But one quick funny story about him, I ended up getting him, again, it was 1992, so I was like roughly 8 years old, I guess. And I was so excited. I think we were at my grandmother's house, and my dad picked this up for me at Walmart on the way over there, and I was so excited. I like finally got a doll that I could play with, and he would rollerblade around. And as soon as I opened the box, I guess you have to know, like, if you weren't around, like most Playline dolls in like the 80s and 90s that were this big were not packaged with like window boxes and stuff. Like the Cabbage Patch Kids were sort of an exception, but most like cheap Playline dolls like this were just in like a solid box with a picture of the doll on front of it. So you really didn't get to lay eyes on the actual doll before taking it out of the box. And when I got to my grandmother's house and opened up the box to take the doll out, I took him out, and his head was missing. Like, I guess they forgot to attach it at the factory or whatever, but I took this thing out of the box, and there was just like a big metal bolt sticking out of his neck, and like a head nowhere to be found, like it was something out of Mortal Kombat. I was so bummed, as you can imagine. And like, I probably thought it was God punishing me for actually getting a doll, but either way, like, we went back to Walmart and my dad exchanged him, and I finally got one that had an actual head on it. But they thought it was really funny. I was kind of traumatized. But yeah, anyway, this is the Rollerblade Dude doll from Mattel, and one of my beloved childhood toys. Let's put him over here today for some moral support. But being denied dolls when I was little, like literally thousands of times, is almost certainly why I'm so interested in it now. I feel like it kind of completes unfinished business from being a child. And, that little boy that sat at the kitchen table crying every day after school is still somewhere inside of me. So, I can't really help but think, like, every time a new package shows up at the house and I open the box and take the doll out, it's like that thought in my head of like, look who we got today. Like, I still feel like my, what we call an inner child is still alive inside. And it just, I'm obviously like spoiling him rotten. I guess it sounds like I need therapy, but at this point, I don't really care. But it has always been seen as a radical idea to give a young boy a doll. And while I don't want to say the terms patriarchal society and misogyny like 1,000 times today, this really is rooted in all that. Most mainstream Playline dolls before Barbie were mostly baby dolls, and they were sort of seen as a means for teaching young girls how to take care of a baby and prepare for motherhood. The concept of the nuclear family has been around for about 100 years now, and that idea popped up not much later than when dolls started getting mass produced in the 1850s. As dolls became more and more industrialized and commercialized, they started to get gendered because I'm assuming it was largely advantageous to do that for marketing reasons. Dolls that were for girls were actually called dolls, and dolls that were for boys were called action figures. Dolls that were marketed towards girls usually conveyed feminine beauty standards if they were fashion dolls, or if they were baby dolls, they were basically young children that needed a caregiver. Dolls marketed towards boys were basically the polar opposite. They were hyper-masculine, violent creatures of destruction. I know this sounds overly simplified, and maybe there's something I'm missing here, but it's really not lost on me that most of the toys that were marketed towards me as a kid were basically trying to teach me how to kick somebody's ass. And to be fair, I probably could have stood to kick a few more asses than I did when I was a kid. But while G.I. Joe and He-Man are technically dolls, I'm really talking about dolls that are made to be a companion or like a young baby that's meant to be cared for or looked after, not action figures. And dolls that needed gentle parenting were a threat to the nuclear family if a boy got his hands on one and, God forbid, tried to take care of it. But people have been pushing against this for decades now. There's a book by the name William's Doll that was written by author Charlotte Zolotow that was published in 1972, and it challenged these stereotypes. It had already caused a buzz of controversy, but that bubbled over further when it was adapted into a children's record called Free to Be You and Me that was the brainchild of actor Marlo Thomas. I'm just going to take the description of the album straight off of Wikipedia because I think it does a pretty good, concise job of explaining what it is. The basic concept was to encourage post-1960s gender neutrality, saluting values such as individuality, tolerance, and comfort with one's identity. A major thematic message is that anyone, whether a boy or girl, can achieve anything. Oh boy, conservatives did not like that one. But anyway, William's Doll is a story of young William who asks for a doll, and his parents say no, his peers tease him, and his dad tries to get him into sports, and ultimately nothing sways William from wanting or asking for a doll. Then William's grandma steps in and saves the day and buys William his first doll and basically explains to William's dad that this is going to be a great tool for William to become a good father someday. Then William grows up to be gay. I'm just kidding, I made that up. But overall, that story sends a really great message that dolls can be really beneficial for boys to enjoy and be part of their learning tools as growing up. Although I would argue that you don't need to spawn humans out of your crotch to be deserving of playing with dolls, but it was the 70s, and all in all, I think that was pretty cool. I don't think it worked though, because literally like 2 decades later, here I was begging for a doll and my parents were saying no. And it's funny how like many parallels there are to like of my story to William's, like down to his grandmother buying him a doll, because my grandmother was pretty supportive of me being able to play with dolls. It was actually quite sweet. And I think of her a lot actually, when I'm around my dolls, because she was one of the few people in my life that just let me be who I was and didn't judge me and, encouraged me to be me. And that's been something that's stuck with me for my whole life. And for a lot of people, it's a really crucial thing. Sometimes it just takes one person to see you and understand you, and it can save your life. But anyway, it's just been a huge uphill battle trying to degender children's toys. We've come a long way since the 50s, obviously, but there are still very few instances of boys being like encouraged to play with dolls and having dolls that were designed and marketed towards boys. I originally wanted to do a separate video talking about these said dolls, but it turns out there's so few of, like, there's literally like almost none of them, and there just wasn't any content to make a video about it. That's like how bleak it is. In the category of like baby and toddler dolls, there's really only one doll that comes to mind that was specifically designed, made, and marketed towards young boys. And if you were born in the 1900s, there's probably a jingle ringing in your ears right now as we speak.
My buddy, my buddy, my buddy, my buddy. Wherever I go, he goes. My buddy, my buddy, my buddy, my buddy and me.
Who could forget My Buddy? My Buddy was released by Hasbro in 1985 and was marketed like any other girl doll was at the time. He wasn't gonna teach you how to hide a switchblade in your backpack or karate chop your sister's head off. He was supposed to be your friend. Your friend to the end. My Buddy dolls were really similarly made to Cabbage Patch Kid dolls and likely were Hasbro's attempt at getting a big old slice of that cabbage pie. And interestingly, I feel like Cabbage Patch Kids were so popular in the 80s that there were a lot of boys that ended up inadvertently getting them. I guess maybe as an investment towards their college tuition or whatever, but Cabbage Patch Kids were literally everywhere. But I was one of those little boys that got to have a Cabbage Patch Kid. They had a lot of boy characters and they made a few that looked like me, so I was allowed to have a Splash and Tan Cabbage Patch Kid. But anyway, like I said, My Buddy was made very similarly to Cabbage Patch Kids. He had like a hard vinyl cast head, but the rest of his body was plush. It was like obviously soft and cuddly. This was a major departure from action figures that were marketed towards boys at the time. My Buddy was also 21 inches tall, and while he wasn't quite life size, that is very, very big for a doll, especially for a boy, at least by society's standards at the time. It seemed like My Buddy was going to be the pioneer that ushered in a whole new era of boys being able to enjoy playing with dolls. That was until he basically immediately became synonymous with Chucky. I don't even think My Buddy was on the market for an entire year before his likeness was basically stolen and turned into Chucky, which was the doll that was possessed by a serial killer in the movie Child's Play. Because there were no other dolls for boys at the time, basically the creators of Chucky had literally one source of inspiration for Chucky, and boy, does he look like a My Buddy doll with maybe slightly different hair. And while Child's Play wasn't the first movie about a killer doll, it was certainly the most popular, and in my opinion is probably the biggest contributor as to why most people think dolls are creepy. My Buddy was discontinued only a few years later, and since then, very, very few dolls have been made and marketed towards boys. I just think it's been a really hard uphill battle because of how deeply ingrained made-up gender roles are in society. Even in 2017, somebody made another attempt at making boy dolls to market towards boys, and I think the project flopped, still after all these years. And why is that? I really think it's because we're focusing on the wrong thing. I've spent a lot of my life being frustrated at how needlessly gendered everything is. There are some languages that literally put a gender on every single inanimate object there is in existence. Like, the sea is female, but the ocean is male. It's a man.
I'm a male. I'm a man. I'm a he.
And that's a fact of the universe for millions of people. In my French classes, we were told that if we didn't know, like, if a word should have la or le in front of it, to just like make your best guess at whether you thought the object was like womanly or manly. Like literally, like if it had curves and stuff, maybe it was more likely to need the like the article, what's the word? The word la in front of it. And like, I just, like, that's so crazy, right? To be fair, my French teacher said this very cheekily. She was actually very progressive and one of my favorite teachers. But yeah, it just was so absurd, I think, to all of us that didn't grow up with this, to see like through a fresh lens how like deeply gendered so much of our world is. But it's really not. Like, this is just stuff that people have put on the world around us. It's not inherently like masculine and feminine, and this is a man's thing and this is a woman's thing. But the world isn't naturally like this. It's just a bunch of shit that really old people made up a long time ago, and none of us have really questioned it since then. So as this pertains to dolls, I would say in most instances, again, this is emphasis on most, not all, so don't come for me in the comments, but in most instances, I don't think we should have dolls that are marketed specifically towards boys. And on the other side of the coin, I don't think that we should have dolls that are specifically marketed towards girls, unless there is a specifically valid reason that only a girl should have a specific doll. But like I said, those instances are few and far between. I don't think that we need to place gender on basically anything. And like I said, that includes, and probably especially includes, children's toys. I just think a lot of harmful discourse around gender is absorbed at a really young age. And that starts through play and the things that our parents tell us that are appropriate for us and aren't appropriate for us. But I do think the US has really leaned way too heavily in gendered parenting. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to pretend boys and girls are, exactly the same in every way, obviously. And I'm also not trying to deny the existence of non-binary people. And side note, I know that I'm talking a lot in the binary today, and it's mainly because we're talking about boys and their context in the world of dolls, which has been something that's obviously for decades and decades and decades traditionally marketed towards girls. So that's why we're mainly saying boys and girls today, just out of, ease of language when talking about what things have been like up until this point. So that's why we're talking about opposite ends of the gender spectrum today. But there is one thing that I think people forget time and time again all throughout history, and that's that everything is made up. Everything that didn't fall out of the sky or grow out of the ground is completely made up by humans. It wasn't here when we got here. Dolls, footballs, dresses, weapons, all of that shit is made up. All of these things were invented by fallible people with limited knowledge, and they've been dead for so long that we don't even know who these people are anymore. So, pink is for girls, blue is for boys. Yeah, that's made up. In fact, 100 years ago, pink was for boys and blue was for girls. It was something about like pink being a variation of the color red, and that was more appropriate for boys because red was a stronger color. And, look, the problem runs deep, but that's kind of besides the point today. Gender trends and standards have changed all throughout history, and they're different amongst cultures. The most highly respected person in the Catholic Church wears a dress. And ironically, a woman isn't allowed to hold that position. But millions and millions of people will respect every single word that comes out of the Pope's mouth and then turn around and see a different man in a very similarly shaped and colored dress, and at the very best will call him a really nasty slur. But in many cases, they're calling for that person to not be alive anymore, if you know what I'm saying. I've just found that most people lack basic critical thinking skills, and that's why so many of these fallacies have just been passed down generation after generation. But so much of what defines gender and what's appropriate by society's standards is often just based on trends. Do you know who this charming little sweetie is? Yeah. That's Franklin D. Roosevelt in his pretty little dress and matching Mary Janes and a haircut that honestly is probably in fashion in Brooklyn right now. So why do so many people get so aggravated when gender norms are challenged? If you guessed misogyny, then you would be right. Without tearing too deep into the complex history of gender, I think most of us can agree that most boys have been raised and brainwashed to believe that they should grow up and control the entire world around them. And you'll see these social structures reinforced in politics, religion, and even in some cases, schools. Gender inequality begins in the earliest stages of childhood. Girls are called bossy if they ask for something that they want, and boys are called sissies if they cry. And in a lot of cases, these standards are projected onto children before the child is even born. So yeah, you get the picture. Kids absorb these things even when they're really little, and the messaging is subtle. How many male versus female superheroes have you seen? Is there even a male term for damsel in distress? Bachelor in a bind? Now, I know that there's a part that I'm leaving out. Children obviously gravitate towards things that they relate to. Of course, a young, rambunctious boy is going to be interested in a story about a man who gets really mad and he turns green and grows muscles and destroys everything around him. And maybe not not so much an easy bake oven. I don't know, unless you're gonna like burn the house down with it. And I'm not saying like rip the Hulk action figures out of the boys' hands and then just corset them with a cooking apron and hit them over the head with an easy bake oven. Plenty of kids, regardless of their age or gender, just don't like dolls, and that's totally fine. But I do think that there are a ton of young boys that would have really loved having a doll if society hadn't deemed it girly, weak, or less than somewhere along the way. We have too many lines drawn in the sand, and you really can't argue to me otherwise. I see misogyny everywhere, and I thought as I got older, things would get better, and it's just not. I feel like misogyny is having a huge resurgence, and I think there are a lot of vulnerable boys and young men that are susceptible to misogynistic messaging that's everywhere on the internet right now, and they're not getting the proper exposure to things that would make them grow up and be empathetic towards girls and women. And I imagine that one of the biggest reasons that I'm a feminist is that I've surrounded myself with girls and women my entire life. I know that sounded like a different kind of brag, but what I mean is like I have known women, I've known girls, and I've also consumed media, whether it's toys, like books, TV shows, movies that have stories that are centered around celebrating women and girls. I'm very familiar with a lot of the frustrations that they encounter throughout their lives, and I'm also like fully aware of the things that they are capable of achieving. But like I said, I think this mostly comes from just seeing yourself as equal and paying attention. One of the major things that kids use their dolls for is to tell stories. They talk to them and they make up entire universes that they imagine them living in. And the dolls basically end up becoming an extension of themselves and their experiences a lot of the times. And I'm sure there are going to be some dickheads in my comment section saying that G.I. Joe is the only version that a young boy should aspire to grow up into being. And, you know, I just obviously don't agree with that. I think that being an empathetic person is one of the most important qualities that we can strive to be as people. It makes the world better for all of us. And blowing up an imaginary children's hospital in an enemy country is not exactly a great device in helping build empathy in a young boy. And respect is learned at a very early age. And I just think that boys being taught that dolls, which are basically miniature versions of women and girls, being taught that those are not objects to be played with or respected or learned about, and shoving them aside just makes it that much easier for boys to grow up and objectify women when they get older, because I think it encourages them to see women as objects and not nuanced people. So this is where American Girl comes in, and this is a really tricky one. American Girl was founded in 1986 as a means for getting young girls excited about history and what it was like to be a young girl back in the olden-timey days. And I think American Girl was trying to show young girls what hundreds of years of progress for girls and women looked like and how they could contribute to that progress as a modern girl. In most cases that I can remember, the protagonists in the American Girl stories don't rely heavily on support from men and boys. In fact, a lot of times the men and boys are villains, or at least some form of tension in the stories. You know, not always, obviously. And I don't think American Girl has an agenda against boys and men, but the primary focus of the brand and storytelling has been empowering young girls. And I think this is very deliberate and also extremely important. That's why I think that there are a lot of people that don't like the fact that boy characters have shown up in the first place, and certainly that there are people like me encouraging young boys to engage in the world of American Girl. But all of this kind of started in 2017 when American Girl introduced their first boy character, Logan Everett. There's deeper lore behind this, but the most important takeaway for today is that he was meant to be the best friend character and bandmate of Tenny Grant, who most of us acknowledge that was likely supposed to be the girl of the year, but that's another episode for another day. But Logan Everett was basically Tenny Grant's best friend. And Tenny Grant, I think, basically was a way for American Girl to steal Taylor Swift's likeness without having to pay for it. Literally, who cares? But very interestingly, in Logan's press tour, when they were basically announcing Tenny and taking her to all the news stations to try and promote the doll, they were very, very clear that Logan was Tenny's friend and not boyfriend or love interest or anything. And I actually think that's really great.
They're not boyfriend, girlfriend. They are bandmates and they're friends.
And Tenny's 10, and really she's focused on her singing
And
career.
this
So
is like people have been asking for a boy character.
yeah, another top request that we've received probably as long as American Girl has been around for 30 years is, when are you going to introduce a boy character? And we are thrilled.
American Girl's main characters generally are about 9 years old, and I just don't like the idea of them simping for some boy, so I think it's good that they've stuck to that all of this time. And maybe part of that reason is I think they realize if they talk about girls having crushes on boys, then all of a sudden there's going to be pressure from people for them to say like, well, what about a girl that has a crush on a girl? And then all of a sudden they're in that dangerous territory where the conservatives are going to come out with the pitchforks and have a field day with all of that. So, but again, at the end of the day, they're 9 years old. I don't think any of us care to have fan fiction about romance between 9-year-olds. But anyway, American Girl had been reportedly struggling with revenue loss, and I think they were just trying to find a new demographic in the age of iPad babies, where more focus was being put on technology and gaming and all of that stuff. And traditional doll play, it's been on the decline for a while, but I really think that was a big step down in terms of doll play was when iPads came out and more kids were just basically being sat in high chairs at restaurants with their face glued to a screen. So I think they were probably looking to try and dip a toe into the market of trying to bring more boys to the brand and find interest there, because like we said, this American Girl brand has been mainly focused towards girls since the beginning. And like I said, in this instance, there's obviously nothing in the world wrong with that. But as sales start to decline, I do think companies start to get desperate and look for customers elsewhere, outside of their main original target demographic. And according to them, people had been requesting boy dolls for years at that point. And, I believe it, even if it's not for their sons to have dolls. I think it's just kind of fun to have some diversity in the universe when you're playing with dolls. And Logan seemingly sold pretty well. I mean, so much that they actually added 4 additional boy dolls to the American Girl doll line just 1 year later. This time they were added to the Truly Me line, which is often characterized as a line in the American Girl range where children can basically pick out a doll that looks more or less like them. And as of 2018, now boys could do this too. And even with a revamp of the Truly Me line this year, with a lot of dolls getting the axe, they decided to keep both of their boy dolls in that product line. In addition, there are options in the Create Your Own doll line that give people the opportunity to choose features so that they can make a custom boy doll as well. And while American Girl has seemingly placed less and less emphasis on chapter books these days, they have published a couple of books that were written specifically for boys. And you do kind of have to dig a little bit on their website, but they are still for sale. The first one was published in 2017, which was the same year that they released their first boy doll, and it's called Guy Stuff, the Body Book for Boys. It's written by Dr. Kara Natterson, whom you may know from being the author in the second book in American Girl's renowned book series, The Care and Keeping of You, which was a book for older girls who had aged out of the first book. I've skimmed through parts of the Guy Stuff book, and it seems to be very informative and non-shaming. Based on what I've heard, it's likely a really good counterpart to the Care and Keeping of You series. Then again, in 2021, American Girl published another book exclusively for boys called Guy Stuff Feelings, which is another self-care book written by Dr. Kara Natterson for boys that helps them understand their emotions and how to handle them. Based on the excerpts I've read, it seems like a really excellent book that's based in scientific evidence and is a great tool to kind of help prevent your son from growing up to perpetuate toxic masculinity. And based on the timing of the first book, I really do think American Girl was very serious, at least at the time, of finding a way to include boys into their target demographic. But I just feel like they're having a really hard time figuring out how to position their products to do so. That, and I think with the continual struggle of trying to keep a toy brand relevant, I think they've kind of put boys on the back burner for now, because I think they're having a hard enough time just getting young girls interested and staying interested in the American Girl brand. I just feel like dolls are becoming less and less popular for girls now, and American Girl is trying to figure out how to compensate for that. And I think they've sort of leaned into making toys that are targeting closer to like 3 to 6 year olds versus like the original mission that was closer to like 6 to 13 maybe. So I think that's kind of where they put all their focus right now, is trying to figure out how to capture younger girls as a target demographic. And, this really difficult uphill battle with boys is probably shoved to the side a little bit for now, I think, which I honestly kind of get it. Again, the brand is called American Girl. And It's an iconic name, and I totally understand why it was a really good brand move at the time to change the name from Pleasant Company to American Girl when Mattel bought it in 1998. It just has more of a punch, and I get why they changed the name, but I don't think it's aging super great, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, even in the 90s, we called them American Girl dolls, so it made sense to change the name to what we actually called them. But obviously, the name is quite limiting. So not only does it seemingly just completely exclude boys altogether in the title, it also excludes basically the entire rest of the world. And I think that's why they've had a really hard time garnering interest in the brand outside of the United States, because I can totally see why somebody in Australia might be like, well, why would I give a shit about this brand? It's not made for us. And you also have to remember that all of the original dolls were telling stories about American history, which obviously isn't as prominent in other parts of the world. And furthermore, now I think people are getting more and more squeamish at the term American, which I know is a controversial thing to say, but there are so many people, especially women, that feel like America isn't representing their values and what they stand for, and also feel actively oppressed by a lot of the laws that are changing in this country. So American Girl had shirts that said, "Proud to be an American Girl" on the front. And I've talked about, like, just as a sidebar, like putting shirts like this in my shop, but I talked with friends about it and they're like, I wouldn't wear this shirt because I'm not exactly proud to be an American girl right now. So there's a lot of that going on, that, this whole concept of like patriotism can often be seen as nationalist and like you're standing for all of the bad things that are happening in our country right now. So again, this isn't a political episode for that particular reason, but at the end of the day, the term American Girl is a very loaded term. It's not as simple as it seemed 30 to 40 years ago. Now, when you say American Girl, it seems very political to say that. And I know it sounds like I'm trying to make the argument that American Girl should change their name to, like, I don't know, like Earth Person or something, but I'm really not. I think it's more complicated than that. And certainly changing the name of a brand as iconic as American Girl is, I think that's probably a bad move. So I'm not trying to argue that they should change their name, but what I am at least hypothesizing is that I think that they are having some trouble expanding their demographic because their name is so specific and limiting. And American Girl is and always has been a very progressive brand. You cannot argue to me otherwise. I know that there are a ton of conservative people that love the brand, but if you pay attention to the stories and the authors that write the books and the brand messaging that they send forward, American Girl is basically a woke brand, and that's awesome. I think you kind of have to be at this point to support girls and women. So anyway, I know they don't have a perfect history. Everybody has some missteps along the way, but all in all, American Girl is a very progressive brand. And despite that, I still don't think that they have figured out how to place boys in that context to be able to celebrate women, uplift girls, celebrate girlhood, and then find a way for boys to participate in that without decentering women from the conversation. But I do think it's time, and as I mentioned earlier, I do think it is such an important thing for boys to engage in stories and toys that are centered around girls and women, because I think it helps develop a mutual understanding of equality. And I think there are a few ways that we can do that, because again, it doesn't mean just going and adding like 50% boys to the product line. That's not what I'm arguing. I really don't want to hear a bunch of stories about boys and men in the American Girl brand. I think that does not serve the mission, and I think the mission is still really important. But I do think that there are steps that can be made towards bringing some more attention from boys into the American Girl brand. And I think one of the very first things they can do is stop using gendered language in their advertising, because it is starting to drive me kind of crazy at this point, because not all the time. I think I've seen a little bit less of it these days, but as a general rule, when you see like their marketing campaigns and stuff, they use language in them that say things like, give her a gift that she'll never forget. And so they're obviously saying like, buy this doll for a girl and only a girl. And it would be super easy to change that to gender neutral language. But I do think that using specifically gender language, like saying she, her, girl, all of this when it comes to advertising the brand to their demographic, I think that that serves as a big step to excluding boys, because I think that there are so many parents that would never consider buying an American Girl doll for their son if all of the catalogs and newsletters that they're getting sent, as advertising are saying, this is for girls, this is for girls, this is for girls. They're not even going to think like, oh, my son would like this. And I actually think that that was a really big reason I wasn't personally allowed to have dolls when I was younger. It's because I wasn't a girl, and it was, dolls were quote unquote for girls. I swear it seems like gender disparity is getting worse and worse these days. And I just feel like any line drawn in the sand at this point just kind of serves to label and oppress people and degrade everyone's quality of life. Setting expectations for someone based on their gender really hurts everyone. And in my opinion, and many people's opinion, it even hurts like the toxic men that feel like they are benefiting off of this system, because they are largely the ones that are perpetuating these ideas. But, there are also plenty of examples of women participating in this as well, which is extra disheartening in my opinion. But I mean, what do you think is causing the male loneliness epidemic? A lot of men have so easily fallen into the trap of all of these online grifters that are making a buck off of feeding into deep-seated misogyny. And I think it's just so easy for them to fall in that trap because so many of them were given messaging when they were younger that they are smarter or stronger and just all around better than girls and women, when they were growing up. It's almost like they were taught to see girls and women as a completely separate species. And we gotta stop doing this shit. So many boys and men have been getting the messaging that the world was built for them because it was. And many of them don't see how much that has actually harmed them a lot more than it's helped them. And that's because, you really need to be a rich, white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian for this stuff to even begin to benefit you. But as a general rule, this stuff hurts just about everybody in society. And if you use happiness as the measure of success and not money and power, I think you will find that there are a ton of miserable men who've just been failed by the system. And some of these men are in my comment section from time to time, and I don't think that they realize that cringiness that they're feeling is basically a trauma response of them having shoved themselves into a mold for their entire lives that, that didn't quite fit who they were. But I think they changed a lot about who they were and the things that they liked so that they would fit in society. And then when they see somebody that doesn't subscribe to that stuff, I think it's a trauma response to just basically try and throw fire at it to get it to go away, because it's too confronting to realize how much of your life you've wasted trying to make other people happy or proud of you. Because the fact of the matter is, I think for most people, you have to sacrifice a lot just so that you can blend in and, feel like you're a good boy. I know this because I've actually experienced this. Like when I was little, again, I've told you my story about how much I was into girly things and dolls and stuff. And that was primarily what I was interested in. I loved creative things and things that had bright colors. And obviously I got a lot of ridicule and shame for that. And like I said before, I was made to feel almost like I wasn't a boy or I wasn't deserving because of the things that I was interested in and how I was. But I remember I must have been at the grocery store. I think I got, this was at a grocery store, but when I was really little, I want to say again, probably like 8 or 9 years old, obviously old enough to read. I remember basically going over to the magazine aisle where all the magazines and stuff were, and that's where the comic books were. And I remember walking over there and just seeing a Superman comic thinking like, I'm going to get this. This will show my parents that that I'm a good boy, that I'm going to make them proud by picking up the Superman comic book. And they bought it for me. Not a hesitation in the world. They said, sure, go ahead. We'll get you the Superman comic. And I feel like that was like the first time I didn't have to fight to ask for something that I wanted when I was a kid. But I went and grabbed it knowing damn well that I wasn't interested in Superman. It just didn't appeal to me. I didn't like the aesthetic and I didn't like how brutal it was. But nevertheless, I grabbed it because I wanted to be a good boy. And I took it home and I read it from cover to cover. And I remember the feeling that I felt when I was done. It wasn't like, oh, wow, that was an awesome story. Or like, I really loved all of the drawings in there and I really relate to this. I just remember the feeling at the end of it was like, I felt like a good boy. That's the best I can describe it, as I felt like I had done something good and I was deserving of love and that my parents would be proud of me because I did something that boys do. And it was a sad feeling for me at the same time because it was something that I didn't enjoy, but to get that feeling of being a quote unquote good boy came at the cost of doing things that I didn't enjoy doing. And it almost served as a further reminder that I was just different. Like I just was different. And I carried that burden with me through a lot of my life. It made me feel like who I was and the things I liked deemed me to be less than, that I wasn't enough of a man. And it was like it took a long time for me to even think of myself as like calling myself a man, because it just sounded like so weird coming out of my mouth, because so many people had tried to diminish my boyhood and manhood for so long that it, like, to say like I'm a man, just like even now it seems kind of weird to say, just because I've been given such different messaging my entire life. And so I guess all of this is to say that this creates a lot of confusion in people, but I do think that there are so many men that have that like desire to feel like I'm a good boy, my dad is proud of me, which is why one of the go-to comments and like, you know, just crappy comment sections on places like Facebook and Instagram, you'll see like, oh yeah, I bet your dad's real proud of you now. Like there's this sense that you have to make your dad proud as a boy or your life is worthless. And that's a super archaic ideal that I wish we could bury, but I see it every single day. This idea that if you aren't manly enough, or this like stereotypical traditional idea of what Americans think a man is, then you haven't made your dad proud and you're a worthless human being. I see that messaging every day. And that's why when I was a little kid, like just walking past the pink aisle in Walmart, I wanted so badly to walk down and look at the Barbies and the new Polly Pockets, because that's what I liked. It's just what I liked, and I don't feel like I have to like give any other excuse than that's just what appealed to me. And I just remember the shame and the fear that was associated with it. Like not just like walking past the aisle and somebody seeing me, but it was just like there's this inner turmoil that you have. Like it's almost, I don't know, like it's really hard to describe, but it's almost like that feeling of like, I'm a bad person. Like if I had stolen something from somebody, it's that same feeling of like embarrassment and shame and like you did something bad. Those are the feelings I got even just trying to quickly shuffle past the pink aisle where all the Barbies were and just like take a quick glance. It was like, I swear I probably walked down that aisle maybe twice in my entire lifetime because I was that scared of it and all of the feelings that would come along with it. And the funny thing is I feel like there are probably a lot of girls that had the opposite experience, where it's like they were forced to walk down the pink aisle and didn't like those things and thought like, oh, am I not enough of a girl? Am I not enough of a woman? Like what like fake imposter am I if I'm standing here in the epitome of girlhood and this doesn't speak to me? I think it works both ways. But all of that being said, I think one of the really cool things about American Girl, as I've sort of taken a deep dive into the history of it and certainly the like product lines, is I love seeing how much of the clothing items that they made for is what was ultimately became the Truly Me line, but their modern line of dolls, which at the time was called American Girl of Today. We have a whole other episode about that if you want to hop back and watch that. But I just loved how many outfits that they made that weren't just like pink frilly dresses or the things that you expected to be made for a doll, especially like in like the mid 90s, you know, that was still at the height of Barbie and it was like hyper feminine, but you could get an American Girl doll and then buy a soccer uniform for her, or a hiking outfit, or I think they had a fly fishing outfit. Like it was just like the amount of diversity that they had in terms of options for stories for your doll and clothing. You had everything from like super feminine frilly floral dresses to hiking outfits. I thought that was such a great message, again, to send to young girls that you can be anything on the spectrum. They weren't trying to make every single modern girl into a princess, because not every modern girl likes that. It was really cool that a girl could buy a really dorky ass fly fishing outfit for her doll and not feel like her gender was going to be questioned. I've seen so many instances over the years of American Girl like setting examples for girls to find who they are and their own interests and their talents. And that's done, I think, with a lot of without a lot of outside pressure. I think even their tagline has been for a while. They might have changed it a little bit, but it's along the lines of like, follow your inner star or find your inner star. It's all about looking from within and figuring out what makes you special and what are your interests, and finding those things from within. And I think that that is a really great way to position a doll brand. And I would love for boys to be able to engage in that some as well. And I think they already are to a very small degree. But I think American Girl has a history of telling stories about girls that challenge expectations. And I not only want to see boys see examples of girls challenging expectations, but also being able to do the same thing for themselves, which, you know, in some instances means being able to buy a doll and enjoy that doll. But I think many adults that have never experienced gender shame directly may not even understand how badly this stuff affects kids. It sometimes can make you feel like you're not even part of the human race. And sadly, a lot of times just makes you feel like you don't have a place in this world. And I get that most parents don't want to see their kids struggle. And I understand the instinct of steering your son away from the pink aisle and liking dolls if you think it will make his life easier later on. So really, at the end of the day, I can't tell you what's right for your kids. And, you know, that's got to be up to you. And I don't know what the consequences are of sending your son with a backpack full of dolls to school this day and age. You know, that can have some really bad real world consequences. And it's just not my call to make, because as right or wrong as something may be, people are going to have different opinions about that. And, you know, people with shitty opinions often hurt people, even if the person that gets hurt is doing the right thing. And I know there's a big stigma around giving boys dolls, because I know a lot of parents worry that that's going to make the child grow up to be gay or transgender just because their kid is showing interest in dolls, which obviously there's nothing wrong about being gay or transgender. But I think that there are still a lot of parents that worry about this. Some, you know, to the point where they think being gay or transgender is a bad thing. And there are some that just don't necessarily think that those are bad things, but they don't want it for their child because they don't want to see their child to struggle. But again, I think parents think that they can control whether their kid turns out gay or transgender, and they just can't. The only thing that they can control really is how they handle it if and when that happens. And, you know, sadly, a lot of parents choose poorly, unfortunately, but you know, at the end of the day, it's not something that they can control. But let me tell you, I've been very visible in the world of dolls in recent years, and I've heard from a lot of cisgender straight men that do enjoy collecting dolls. And I think a lot of them like to keep their hobby a secret. And I understand why, because people ask a lot of ignorant questions and say stupid things. And I know they just don't want to deal with it. So, you know, I think that they sometimes will hide the fact that they're interested in them. But like I said, dolls have no impact on your sexuality or even your gender. You can just like something because it's pretty and you like it. It doesn't have to mean anything about who you are as a person. But sadly, a lot of people make those conclusions. I mean, you look at things like Saturday Night Live, they had an entire skit about a grown man going to the American Girl store, and they did everything they could do to make sure that that character came across as a creep that made everybody uncomfortable. And that's why I think doll companies really need to start taking stock of what kind of messaging they're sending, because it may seem innocent on the surface, just like, oh, isn't this cute? Look at this girl playing with dolls. But if they continually exclude boys from the conversation, this is how we end up getting messaging that, okay, if a boy likes dolls, he is so different and outside the norm, we're going to label him as other and find ways of ridiculing him, not only as a child, but obviously also as an adult as well. But as it relates to American Girl, I know so much of the discourse is around this is for girls because it's meant to empower girls. And I totally understand that, but I think that can be for boys too. I think there's a big difference between saying that your company is about girls versus saying your company is for girls. There's a major difference there. It can be about girls and be for every gender in existence. And I really think it starts at the company level, because I know that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of boys that would have been encouraged to play with dolls if the language just encouraged them to do so. You would be surprised at how many parents need permission from a company to buy their son a doll. And then with that permission, they wouldn't think twice about it. The only reason I was allowed to have this doll right here was because of this image right here. I think if this doll had been gendered as a girl and it had shown a girl playing with the doll, I would have been told the same thing I got told when I asked for an American Girl doll. And All that was needed was this one little picture on the side of the box for me to go, hey dad, can I have this? Look. And he saw a boy playing with a doll doing a sport and he said, sure. He didn't think twice about it. And so that's why this is so important to me, is because I've experienced firsthand what these subtle language differences can do. And basically, I mean, I don't want to say change the world, but honestly, it kind of can change the world. All right, I got to put this down. Hang on. And yeah, so with regards to gender equality, I know that we have a long way to go before true equality is actually achieved. But I think a big part of that is going to be making sure that future generations of young men inherently respect things that are feminine and make space for women. And what better way than to give a little boy a really cool doll when he asks for it? Or don't, and enjoy dying alone. All right, that's it for today. I am on Patreon with a ton more American Girl content, things like unboxings, pleasant company education, and general doll clownery. Patreon is how I'm able to put resources into videos like this one for free on YouTube, so I would love it if you would check it out. I usually post about 3 videos per month on Patreon, and it's a really good way to just kind of hang out and forget about your existential dread for an hour and just think about dolls. Works for me. But if Patreon isn't your thing, I've also got loads of other videos on YouTube, so we can just stay here and keep hanging out. All right, hit the subscribe button and I'll see you later. Bye.